Thank you for that introduction. It's been so lovely to be here today and hear from people whose work has been very important to me, and I feel like we're a part of this extended conversation. And I can echo what Oksana said earlier. I'm tempted to just jump in and start talking about all the papers I heard today, but I hope we'll also see that the talk I prepared is resonating intensely. And I've changed the title somewhat to Men of Energy. You all may have heard that there was a presidential election in the United States recently. And this happened. We've been talking about this a lot. Yay! I don't know when is the last time I felt that kind of joy. And it's important to know that Musk did not come to Trump by himself. He was part of a Silicon Valley crew. So this is David Sachs, who is now going to be the incoming White House AI and crypto czar. And he says, come on in, the water's warm. This was last summer with a list of big Silicon Valley types. In many ways, this alliance between what I've seen called the trad bros and the tech bros makes perfect sense. Musk and all these friends are neoliberals, and scholars of neoliberalism, Wendy Brown in particular, has warned for at least 20 years that neoliberalism is in partnership with authoritarian violence. And recently, she chalks this up to neoliberalism. And this is not fascism, she says. So behold the reactive creature fashioned by neoliberal reason and its effects. Neoliberalism is the extension of market logics to every realm of life. So this Trump-Musk formation, Brown says, is related to 1930s fascism, but it's distinct because it grows out of the neoliberal destruction of society. Neoliberalism, though, has been facing a crisis of hegemony, and I mean that in the Gramscian sense, that power operates through both coercion, outright violence, and also consent, a broad sense of hegemony. And it needed to neoliberalism needed to plug into a broader range of affects, and it did. It's helped along by this white masculinist backlash. I've learned a lot from Brown about neoliberalism, but I am not sure about this refusal of the term fascism. The historical continuity is too important. The recognition that this is an ever-changing partnership, not just between neoliberalism and fascism, but between liberal capitalism and violent order. And indeed, that's how Aimé Césaire saw this relationship in the 30s and 40s as a circulation of colonial violence. At the end of capitalism, there's Hitler, quite simply. What I appreciate about Césaire is his appreciation for how fascism works at the level of the body, its affects. Fascism is what happens when the efforts to put violence at a distance, both in space, to put violence other places, and psychologically, break down, when liberalism feels too much like hypocrisy to be supportable. So he has many beautiful quotes from Discourse on Colonialism, and he says, colonization works to decivilize the colonizer, to brutalize him in the true sense of the word. With every violence that is accepted and explained away, a gangrene sets in, a center of infection begins to spread. And I want us to think about ecological violence in the same sense, the way that the sort of putting elsewhere of ecological violence, especially from the global north, might have these same effects. But you don't even need political theory, as much as I love political theory, to see why Trump and Musk make sense. Billionaires, simply motivated by egotistical power, seeking to profit from controlling the state and its military contracts. No, this is intentional so that you look at me. That's And they had grown unhappy under the Biden administration because Biden appointed people who started to crack down on tech monopolies, who were very skeptical about crypto. So especially the Silicon Valley financiers who are into crypto, who are fearing this kind of monopolistic crackdown. From a functionalist and a materialist perspective, it makes perfect sense that they, decide to switch over to the new ruler. There are lots of reasons that this merger is of a piece with the history of imperial capitalism. But in other ways, and I think this is why it's coming up here today, this is a uniquely interesting historical merger. It's a key moment in the unfolding of late capitalism in a period of climate crisis. And indeed in a period of intense polycrisis, a crisis of hegemony for neoliberalism, for capitalism, for fossil fuels. And in that moment, we are witnessing these different kinds of political formations. They are continuous with a longer history, and yet they're also novel in form and style. In the talk today, I want to focus on the significant role of gender and energy in these political formations, how technoscience interacts with a shifting patriarchal logic. Gender and energy usually appear as separate problems in US politics. Climate change did not end up being a significant central issue in the campaign this year. Energy was a topic, but mostly with Harris and Trump competing over who was the stronger supporter of fracking for gas. However, gender was a key campaign issue. And I wanted to show just a few pictures of the first reported preventable deaths since the overturning of Roe v. Wade, in part out of my feminist anger at people who say the first Trump administration ended up being not that bad. About 1/3 of people of reproductive age in the US are now living in states where abortion is banned, which is leading to a widespread and underreported kind of slow violence against women. And the misogyny and sexual harassment, anti-queer, anti-trans politics of the MAGA movement continued. So gender actually was a big issue in this campaign. But the common sense view in media and punditry is that the economy is separate from so-called women's or identity issues, and voters apparently chose the economy even if they might not have agreed with or liked the misogyny and the abortion bans. And I think because of the special focus of people in this room, many of you may know that after the first Trump election, I started talking about this term petro-masculinity to insist that these things are actually not separate, they're structurally and historically connected. There's a convergence between the support of fossil fuels, hyper-masculinity, which I define as a reactive masculinity in the face of a sense of lost entitlement and impotence, and then a turn to authoritarianism to kind of cement those lost entitlements. And we should not be surprised then to see them keep coming up together. And Project 2025, which was the plan for a future conservative presidency, doubled down on petro-masculinity. The preface of Project 2025 had 4 pillars, and the first one was defense of the family, anti-feminist, anti-queer. And the third pillar was defense of America's bounty, by which most of the language was about stopping the war on oil or gas and insisting on unleashing energy dominance. To my surprise, after writing about petro-masculinity, which I expected to be read by people in this room and maybe a few other feminists, went viral, I mean, in a minor way, outside of academia. And it was surprising because I didn't think that feminist concepts necessarily had that kind of cachet, but I think it went viral because people were seeing the misogyny as something that they wanted explained, they wanted to talk about. So in some ways this was heartening. It was not heartening in the sense that it also drew the attention of the right, and I was harassed and trolled, but also what I noticed in all this harassment was no one on the right said I was wrong. They just didn't like that I was pointing it out, and they didn't see what was wrong with it. So, for example, this was a roundtable where the Heartland Institute, which is funded by the Koch Foundation, ridiculed me and my idea, but the title of it and what they were doing was embracing petro-masculinity. And I think this is a drop of fossil gas on this superhero's costume. Almost every time I spoke about petro-masculinity since Trump's first administration, Musk kept coming up. People seemed to think it was obvious that this was not actually just a problem with fossil fuels in the far right. There was another kind of hypermasculinity that was obvious in green capitalist projects, and Musk was the avatar. And at that time, Musk was kind of the avatar or extreme version of what was wrong with liberalism in the US with the Democratic Party's plans. For a while, he seemed like the hero to some who could save us from fossil power. Martin Hultman, who's a scholar in Sweden, called this ecomodern masculinity, and it is the ideology of green capitalism. And Marcus Giesler, another scholar, called it Tesla man, who combines individualism, can-do spirit, and an unshakable faith in the markets with a sensible care for nature and the planet. And ecomodernism travels beyond Musk and Silicon Valley. It's evident in the plans for energy transition of most major institutions and wealthy states that rely on techno fixes and in many ways resonate with Musk. Unlike fossil fuels, I would argue that ecomodernism does still have hegemonic power. In Gramsci's terms, it's not just practiced through domination, but through consensus, through widespread legitimacy. I'm arguing that, but I'm not completely sure of it. I could be convinced otherwise. And that legitimacy is an obstacle to other visions for energy. So I am, as the introduction said, also thinking about what would feminist energy systems, decolonial energy systems look like. And the thing I'm finding is I don't think we need a lot of new ideas about that. They exist everywhere. I've become convinced the problem is the political obstacles to having those taken seriously, to implementing them. And this demand for constant new ideas is kind of another delay tactic. Hence my interest in these formations that block other energy visions. So this leads to this question that I'm still mulling over. Sometimes I feel like Foucault, at the end of his life, where he starts talking about neoliberalism, and he becomes so obsessed with it that some scholars since have said maybe Foucault actually liked neoliberalism. Like maybe he was so seduced by it. Clearly, all the attention he spent on it. Sometimes I wonder, like, why I'm so hung up on this. And again, I say it's because I feel this obstacle to other kinds of visions, but I have to think there is this allure, there's an affective seduction there that fascinates me. And this is really the basis of my talk today, is less about observing the political machinations of these two and more about, like, what is this seductive power and how does it get channeled through gender? It's hardly surprising, on the one hand, that sexism is showing up among powerful men. However, there is something more going on with sexism here in terms of its vitriol, this patriarchal backlash that has become key to right-wing movements worldwide and also a consistent partner to climate denial. So we see these familiar faces. I couldn't find the thumbs up picture with Putin, but I'm sure it exists. Recently, the Argentinian president, Javier Milei, has been very close to Musk and Trump, and he ran on a strong anti-feminist platform. And we have also Orban. This is a common sort of connection that they make less climate panic, more babies. This is very central to Musk's ideas about population. So by bringing misogyny into the story and energy, I hope to illuminate two things here. And first is a materialist insight, the importance of what is called reproductive labor to maintaining a colonial capitalist system that often gets obscured in most discussions of energy and climate crisis, unless you're talking to a feminist. And second, an appreciation, again, of affect. So the first question that I get I just spoke to a journalist this week who wanted me to talk about petro-masculinity, and she asks the same question, and it should be a question I have an answer for, which is, what is the connection between masculinity and fossil fuels? After all, the whole point of my article was to say that there is one. And I have a lot of answers about the history of them and the material connection between highway systems and so on. But this question still bothers me because I think there's something bigger there about the relationship between gender and energy. And so what I want to play with today is that energy is routed through gendered bodies and desires and practices, helping to secure legitimacy. So gender, in a way, helps to secure the legitimacy of energy, and energy at the same time is fueling gender. So thinking through gender, energy, and technology a little more. And I'd love your feedback. So here's the outline of my talk. First, this materialist angle about ecofeminism and reproductive labor, just to set up where I come from theoretically. Second, the most interesting part of this tech bro, trad bro contradiction is their relationship to modern technology and to masculinity. I want to think about how they go together. And third, again, I often was asked about Musk in the past as an avatar of liberal green capitalist plans. Now that people are associating Musk in some fashion with the right, what does it mean for liberalism itself? Because I've had a lot of feedback from people who feel very defensive of liberalism as something that can still be saved from neoliberalism, and of course from fascism. So I want to talk about ecomodern feminism, if we might call it that. All right, so first, an ecofeminist picture of energy. And here I'm going to draw on Nancy Fraser's work in Cannibal Capitalism, but try to apply it to energy. So most often, almost always, energy is thought about in the realm of exchange. So questions like demand and cost are just appearing there without any understanding of where they're coming from or what historically and socially constructed them. And Marxists famously have noted that behind the realm of exchange was what Marx called a hidden abode. That's the English translation, at least of Marx, of production. And that's where labor exploitation happens. So it was important to Marx that that was hidden. Feminists and decolonial scholars and anti-racist scholars have built upon and complicated Marx, Nancy Fraser being one of them, to say production is not the end of the story here. There are further hidden abodes. So to show up at work in the capitalist system, there are other spheres that have to be exploited and extracted from. And this is my map of Fraser's argument. And Fraser, I think in many ways, is drawing on Maria Mies, who's a German ecofeminist from the 80s, who was thinking about the way that I really was reminded of Oksana's point that philosophers love to think in threes. So here's a three for you. There's three further hidden abodes. You might call them care or reproductive labor. Nancy Fraser calls it the state. I find it more useful to just call it empire, modern Western empire, and earth or nature. And each of these sites has to remain hidden to make the economy seem like a separate thing. But the violence and extraction from and to these sites are very important for production and exchange to happen. So, for example, neoliberalism claims that it wants a small state, it's very anti-state, but in actual fact, there's quite a lot of the state required to uphold property and extractive regimes around property. You could see across each of these the way that gender is very important in legitimizing why these are natural sites of extraction, why these are entitlements for free or cheap forces and labors. Obviously, in the realm of care, the artificial separation of reproductive labor from productive labor, but also in the realm of the state, the way that the state is often conceived of as a feminized nation to be protected by masculinized soldier bodies. And you see that the importance of ethno-nationalism to fascist movements. And then the earth and nature being feminized, racialized, and then people closest to earth and nature also being accorded lower status, or their labors being taken for granted or cheaply. Now, I'm really drawn to these typologies. I think they're useful to help us map out and think about what's happening in this very complex world. And Fraser is a complex thinker. She knows these are all entangled. So this is in kind of a crude, to put anything onto a map like this is very crude. But what is missing from this picture is it risks making power look too tidy and functionalist. Like there's these interests of extraction and they work to uphold all these things and it works together like a bunch of Lego blocks. On the one hand, that's true in some sense, but what's missing from this map is affect, is this Gramscian notion of hegemony as how power operates. It operates not only through enforcing all these boundaries, violent extraction and exploitation. In order to sustain itself, it needs legitimacy. And that legitimacy is where our work as cultural theorists comes in. So all of these lines, for example, of petro-masculinity, defending this patriarchal household, defending the nation state, defending the right of extraction, those are happening violently, but they're also happening affectively. They're very appealing. And I think gender is key to that appeal and to how that happens on the level of the body. So trying to think more broadly here about gender and energy, I'm turning to techno-feminism for one idea, which is that technology is both a source and a consequence of gender relations. People do their gender through technologies, so that's often where people's mind goes when they hear petro-masculinity. Like, oh yeah, men like big trucks, they do their gender through these big energetic explosions. But also technologies do gender through people's bodies. Technologies structure everyday lives to sustain a gender order, making certain kinds of desires and practices more possible and more desirable and actionable than others. So fossil fuel technologies and energy more broadly are not just tools or ways that are adding power to patriarchal order, they're also shaping a gender order. And in turn, the creation of this erotic appeal around a certain kind of bodily agency and the entitlements that produces help to reproduce that energy order, especially in crisis. And the way that this is playing out, to go to the next part of the talk in terms of this relationship of tech bros and trad bros, is really complex. And it's not, you can't reduce it to any unitary view of what masculinity means or even what its relationship is to modern technology. On the one hand, and this was true in the 20th century, Nazism combined both a nostalgia for pre-modern masculinity with a love of cars and industrial work. And you can see this same combination today. So on the one hand, there is this consistent stream of an idea that modern technology has emasculated men. And there's nostalgia for all different kinds of pre-modern masculinities, usually very white and Western fantasies of a past when the strong ruled the weak, and also when the strong ruled the weak, and that brought glory, to use Gretchen's term. And Bronze Age pervert is, I've learned this, a very influential right-wing influencer who got his PhD at Yale and is widely read by the MAGA-verse and the manosphere. So in this world you have, these are the pictures on the left are from his Instagram stream, and then of course you have the famous QAnon shaman who's bringing a lot of these images together. So it could be neo-pagan, neo-Viking, neo-medieval, and it also blends into an eco-fascism that that can be appealing maybe to some of us in this room who have our own doubts about what modern technology means and how it has alienated us from the natural world. So they're like going down all these rabbit holes and looking at these images, you get the seductive appeal of it, because this desire of a better connection to the world can very easily be co-opted and turned towards these fascist tropes. And you see that happening in the US a lot, especially, I would say, in terms of the so-called trad wife, like the women's component of this idea of the modern world having actually ended up hurting women, and shouldn't we all return to this innocent kind of feminized housework that is also very beautiful. It's always way more beautiful than reality. Okay, so we have this nostalgia where what we want is a pre-modern, pre-capitalist, very homoerotic, like male torsos are the main thing here, even though it is heteronormative. We have this version, but then we also have a nostalgia for the mid-20th century, this moment of fantasy of the innocence of American power. And I included on the right Soviet realist art. We've already had some discussion of that today because there are interesting parallels. Here, men's strong bodies are directly part of the electrical and energetic system. The threat that industry once posed to warrior masculinity is metabolized, and now men's strength is connected to labor and war and national power. And the bottom of this ad on the left says, "Let's keep Colossus strong and we'll all remain free." And that could very much be the sort of far-right slogan. So here it is, keeping a white man strong, and it is specifically a white man, because I invite you to imagine a black man in this ad in the 1950s. It only works with the combination of white supremacy. Keeping a white man strong will keep America strong, and also keeps the electrical grid consistent. So this ad is about the threat posed, the problem of intermittency of power. And of course, this is connected to the American consumer dream, this idea of life in the suburbs served by a trad wife, and this is the trad bro territory. And then we have the futurist masculinity of people like Musk. So this is the Tesla that Musk sent to orbit Mars, I think. Polyamory, artificial wombs, in the place of Christian families where women submit to their husbands. Colonizing Mars in clean white spacesuits in the place of coal-dusted miners. This future is also a kind of nostalgia for a time when there was supposedly innocence around American technological expansion. So these are quite different, and yet there are some shared patterns. And what they share is a patriarchal and colonial relation to nature, going back to that ecofeminist chart. They share an interest in preserving those hidden abodes. These are slides, again, from the 1950s from Union Carbide, which is one of the first petrochemical companies and was also the company involved in the Bhopal disaster. And they had this series of ads with giant hands. And so all of these kinds of nostalgia, I think, are about technology that can go in your hand, like technology that doesn't control you, but that you control. The key is size. This technology is threatening in terms of what it can unleash, chaos, complexity, but the strength of man controls it. So in a way, the more and more the technology becomes chaotic and disastrous and destructive, the more and more you need the big hand of man to control it, the more you need hegemonic masculinity. And the other thing that these visions share is an enemy, and that enemy is emasculation, encapsulated by the popular phrase soy boys, this is slang used to describe men who completely and utterly lack all necessary masculine qualities. They're wearing the famous self-made pussy hats from the Women's March. And what's interesting here is this is not anti-technology. This is a different relationship to technology. These are feminized technologies, and they're feminized because the aim of them is constraint. So vegetarianism instead of eating a lot of meat. Wind and solar could be feminizing if they're part of a vision that is about limiting fossil fuels or limiting energy. The word unleash is a frequent one in the energy plans of the MAGA crew, implying an energy that has purposefully been held back. So wind and energy could be part of unleashing masculine energy if they are part of a sort of all of the above plan. Okay, so to sum up, we typically have this contrast between a kind of engineering hand of God masculinity and a warrior masculinity. But I think historically they have worked together and they continue to work together. And what they share in terms of their relationship to technology is the desire for control. And not just control, but control towards a project of dynamism. All right, this is one defense of the project of energy expansion. But now I want to turn to the what is now the main opponent of that in major energy and climate policy making, which is liberalism. What does this mean for liberalism and its support for green capitalism? And this is an important question too, because the left, which whatever that means, sort of where I might identify myself, has defined itself against liberalism and fascism and pointed out their relationship to each other. And now we have this sort of triangulation of neoliberal fascism, liberalism, and the left. And I think what we're witnessing is a crisis of hegemony for all of these and different affective strategies that are more and less successful. And I would argue the left is not very successful at strategically using affect. Okay, so one view of liberalism from liberals, and I was just told this by a very defensive professor a couple months ago, is that Musk is a neoliberal, not a liberal. And neoliberalism is a bastardization of liberalism. And liberalism is an umbrella that can combine a lot of diversity and variety. So saying you cast out liberalism because of Musk would be like saying you cast out socialism because of Stalin. You could have a Keynesian welfare state, a Green New Deal style of climate politics. And liberalism has also provided the language for anti-colonial and feminist movements. And it's undeniably true that if I'm standing here today as a feminist, it is in large part because of liberal feminist victories. fewer people suffer under Biden's climate policies than they will under Trump or under Germany's green policies, which are about taming capitalism. On the other hand, Marxists and many people on the left and this woman say, is there really a difference? Isn't this just a good cop, bad cop relationship between liberalism and fascism? There is no lesser evil. If you look at support for genocide against Palestinians, if you look at the absence of a serious climate message in the last election, and so on, corporate overlords. The question of how liberalism and neoliberalism are related is a difficult one. And for me, adding ecology to the picture is really clarifying. So instead of going down into liberal theory, thinking about what is the ontological essence of liberalism and what does it mean for relations to the more than human world. Socialism truly can also be extractive, patriarchal, but it's not necessarily so. Ecological Marxists have shown there are resources for sustainability within Marxist critique. The same cannot be said of liberalism because its ontological foundation is in the possessive, independent self. And that possessive self is a hegemonic adult man, usually, who has to put all of their dependencies that are really the fact of life into these hidden abodes. So the liberal self needs the hidden abodes to remain. And however much you expand the project of becoming an independent possessive self, you are sort of over and over again confronting that contradiction of life, which is that dependency is part of life. And that dependency, in order to claim independence, dependency has to go into these hidden abodes. And fundamentally, that possessive self is a self that is bounded and separate from its relationship with nature. Nature is the thing that your body mixes with in labor and becomes property, from John Locke. And ultimately, the sort of prominent way a liberal theory can think about nature is as a thing that might deserve rights of nature. So how does this appear in terms of gender? Because my argument has been that gender is an important way that legitimacy is secured in these regimes. And I think we can notice how liberal feminism has taken on board the problem of the climate crisis. In recent years, the empowered woman has emerged as an attractive solution to capitalism's problems, and she has attracted the attention of corporate interests and civil society. So I'm going to skip ahead here. M. Murphy wrote a phenomenal book about neoliberalism and called this figure the investable girl. The investable girl has become an alibi for capitalism. The girl is connected to a rich set of data points linking her education or her access to birth control to positive economic development. And Murphy writes that the girl is imbued with the liberal feminist promise of individual agency. She is an emotional cocktail that includes anxiety about global economic futures, empathy for the harsh and cruel lives of some girls, attachments to broken girls known or imagined, hope and admiration for the amazingness of girls, liberal feminist aspirations for agentic and equal life, personal desires to help and rescue, belief that technoscience will offer the right lever to be pulled. So in other words, Murphy says the girl pulls hopeful affect in. And this is really what I've been trying to talk about, the way gendered figures pull hopeful affect in. Much the way that the petro-masculine man does, the ecomodern man, the trad wife. Murphy's focus is on reproductive technology, and I think you can take this argument into the world of energy and see how the investable woman and the investable solar panel, for example, function in a similar way. Women and clean energy here are good investments, each on their own and especially together. And like the investable girl, the focus is on productivity. So this is the UN Development Program saying access to energy, especially when it enables the productive use of electricity, provides support to improve livelihoods by increasing income by up to 2.5 times. The investable girl allows women to become wind turbine engineers, solar panel owners, investors, and here the call is always for more data. The problem is that we don't have enough gendered data to know what's happening with women, and we need more data to show, more data points to show this confluence of the way that liberating women can improve the economy and so on and so forth. Empowering women makes a good return on investment, as does making more solar and wind energy. And I think this graphic from USAID's work in Pakistan really can sum up what energy justice means in most Green New Deal plans I've seen at the state level. Notice the dotted line that goes from the wind turbine to the bag of money, with women now connecting the thread. Here we have the liberal feminist version of the mid-20th century Colossus Man ads. So we see how this neoliberal or liberal shift has happened in the intervening decades. The Colossus men were about national power, the military, through the powers flowing through the bodies of strong men who are looming over top of these very tiny little industrial things that are completely under their control. The liberal feminist answer is about the bodies of women and the blades of turbines, which are made much smaller. If you've ever stood beside a turbine, you know that that is not what it feels like. But the women are also not looming over and sort of controlling the turbines either. Here, the point is that they're all turning into money. The women receive some of the power of wind, but their gender liberation does not involve a promise to control it. And whose hand is that holding the money bag? I think we all know the answer to that. But Murphy points out, what if the numbers don't add up for girls? And what if, as is the case, all women cannot be liberated into the world of STEM jobs without leaving behind reproductive work for expendable women and people? And I would ask, what if the numbers don't add up for solar and wind energy? Energy sufficiency, community-owned energy, energy justice are usually not good investments, frankly, on these terms. In the words of so many energy policymakers, it's not realistic, these ideas about energy transformation towards truly just and sustainable systems, by which they mean it's not attractive to investors. What happens when Musk and Trump say, actually, women in solar aren't good for profit, they're not good investments, and what if they're right? I have really conflicted feelings about making this critique. I've seen the violence done by liberal feminism historically, since the 19th century, when white liberal feminists turned against black feminists on the question of the importance of the right to vote over other things. I also feel that solidarity is important. I want to build tactical alliances more than I want to just go around bringing everybody down. Do I really want to spend time critiquing projects that are bringing money and energy to women who really need them, when the alternative is drill, baby, drill, and sexual violence? Women disproportionately suffer energy poverty. Their lives are improved by energy, even if it's coming in the language of liberalism. And this high liberal language of the USAID often looks very different on the ground. Women can claim these resources, and they do, towards their own ends. So Murphy ends too with some of these tricky questions and asks, or notices, for a moment the options seem to be caring in the wrong way or not caring at all. And this kind of captures the way I feel often looking at energy transition as it's happening all around us. So, coming to the end here, and turning back to my starting question, what is the relationship between energy and gender and this notion of transition and the legitimacy of capitalism as it tries to evolve or adapt to energy transition? And to practice feminist humility, I'm left with more questions than answers, and perhaps that's why I keep on at these questions. And also things are just constantly changing all around us. But I think what these powerful figures show, especially the investable woman, is that there are powerful desires for agency, for connection, for building better worlds. And there is a lot of anxiety about modern technology, and that gender is a really crucial way that these anxieties are being processed. Capitalism also has not captured every desire and every affect. So these desires exist within and are created by capitalism, but they are also outside of capitalism. And I'll end with this question, which is the provocation with this piece of art that says, "We are on fire, not in a sexy way," because we've talked a lot about fire today, and you'll notice this is a very, very old, kind of rusty, empty piece of modern technology that is no longer functional, we can kind of tell. But I think the provocation of this art is to suggest that actually there is a sexy way for the world to be on fire. And this insistence, it's not a sexy way. Being on fire is part of energy cultures of expansion, of productive work that fuel gender, and even the idea of how gender is practiced and how gender might be a liberatory path, even for a feminist response to climate. And this can feel good. It really does have this erotic and seductive charge that we ignore at our peril. There's a lot of effort on the left to make sure that everyone understands that it is not sexy. I think most of our work is about saying, this is really not sexy. No. And including this talk, most of this talk is me saying, look, this is not sexy, through the work of critique, of irony, of protest. But there's also the possibility to understand the erotic charge of energy, to understand how important gender and racial and other kinds of personal bodily liberation is to the question of energy, and to ask how to make it sexy to not be on fire. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And now we have enough time for discussion, comments, questions, and okay, Imre, you'll go first. Then yeah, Katie and.
So everybody always says thanks, that was so great, and so on. But I think I want to really insist that that was super, super exciting. You have my head buzzing with all kinds of questions that I want to give you. So I'm just going to give you two because I know other people have things to talk about. So one is maybe less a question than a comment. I'll put that out there first off because people don't often make comments, not questions. So there is a body of liberal texts that try to respond to the first Trump government. And I'm thinking of texts by Francis Fukuyama and Yael Tamir and Anatol Lieven and others. And they're apologias. And what their apologias are about is that they say, oh, we shouldn't have done the neoliberal internationalism. That was a mistake. because we have nothing to say about what liberalism has to say about nations. There's some kind of misfit between liberalism and nationalism, and they see nationalism as important to the liberal project, and they don't know now how to do anything about that. And I'm wondering if this comes up at all in your work, or if you could just speculate about it in relation to gender. The images that you showed to me were sort of saying, oh, women are international. It's amazing. They look at the whole world. And maybe they're international in a way that isn't neoliberal. But that might be the wrong message at this moment. Or maybe it's the right message, but maybe it's not quite fitting with what has to be done around a rebuilding of a national affect, however creepy that sounds, because that's precisely what kinds of fascism are. So first thing is, I'm curious about why these liberals would, again, just kind of speculate, why these liberals are so fascinated with they're missing the message on nationalism. And the second question is just trying to think through the different kinds of masculinity you laid out. So one of them is this kind of post-war masculinity of the, not just the kind of colossus you were showing, but I always think about the reactionary image in Trump's head is of like American graffiti and of young guys with cigarettes in their sleeves, like fixing their car. And then this new kind of tech bro, you can't fix an electric car. So then you need a different kind of image. It's precisely like sealed. It's like an Apple computer. You can't do a single thing to it. But there's another thing about, so it's kind of a weird masculinity. It's like, I get the Tesla, I can't do a thing to it. I'm not gonna fix it. I'm not gonna teach my son how to fix it. You know, it's kind of like, yeah, son, let's take it to the Tesla shop because we have nothing to do with it. But the real question's around the geopolitical configurations of the two different masculinities. So the first one was definitely a kind of a anti-Soviet masculinity. The second one doesn't seem to have that same oppositional mode in relation to masculinity. This is my question, does it? Am I missing something? If it's about a geopolitical move, then one would expect another kind of masculinity that it's competing against. But if China's the hegemonic interlocutor, it doesn't seem like there's any feedback there. And so perhaps this is why there has to be other feedback. Hungarians, Turks, very different kinds of people. Indians, it seems weird. It kind of doesn't flow in the same kind of way. So again, just a question, is there a geopolitics to masculinity which is very different now? That might then tell us something about how masculinity is functioning, and perhaps even why there can be this dialogue between two very different kinds of masculinity. One that seems to speak back to an older moment, and one that speaks back, or one that's about the present and the future. I hope that's coherent.
Yeah, those are very rich questions that I wish I had in my notebook, but hopefully this is recorded so I can come back to thinking about them. I'll take the second one. Yes, it's easy for the far right masculinity is an ethno-nationalist project. It has obvious others, this effort to bound the ethno-nation. And I think what you're saying is that there's almost it's difficult to know what is the other to the masculinity of the ecomodernist space vision. It's why I started with that typology of Fraser, because it's helpful for me when I'm wading into this thicket that seems very full of contradictions to think back structurally and look at the project depends still upon maintaining the hidden abodes, I was thinking a lot with Gretchen on magic, because magic is so much about what has to remain invisible. And the showmanship that goes into making that feel magical instead of like just violence. So I think it's one reason why I think the other it easily becomes feminists for Musk, which was kind of a surprising thing. I didn't know that Musk was going to really get that worried about feminists, and that he's really got into the anti-trans, anti-queer. On some level, that just looks like, is that just cynical politicking? But I think there's a deeper sense there that the world must continue to feed in these cheapened entitlements to labor and force. But I think you're right, it doesn't show up on the level of nation state for ecomodernism. It can if it's sensed that there are nations opposing that plan, or that there's some kind of competition to occupy Mars. But I think your questions about nationalism are really interesting, because I don't know what is the play of it today. On the question of liberalism and nationalism, well, I mean, to me, the liberal project, I'm influenced by Graeber's and Wengrow's recent reading of the Enlightenment as a response to an encounter with difference in the New World. And I think the liberal project has always been about global encounters, and in a sense also has a strong internationalist bent with someone like Kant, or because the idea of liberalism really, in some sense, was about overthrowing the monarchs who were the leaders of the state, and this idea of universalism is really important to liberalism, and it's also its key contradiction and problem. This notion that there's this universal, everyone accords to this view. And so I think there are ontological reasons why liberalism didn't theoretically have an answer or an interaction with nationalism. However, we also see that liberalism was really part of an imperial project, and nationalism in the 19th century became so important to that. And this is why this partnership, this kind of Janus-faced rule between the torso and the hand, or the aggressive warriors and the engineers, is interesting and important, because I think maybe it's the hidden abode of liberalism. I don't know.
Thanks, that's fantastic.
Okay, Katie, please.
Thank you for your talk. It's very convincing. My question is the following. You made juxtaposition between the crude resource neoliberalism and then the liberal opportunities and potentialities. Definitely this is at stake in many contexts, in many political contexts, in elections, in post-socialist space, for instance. Now when there are fierce uprisings in Georgia, also there is the war between the liberal values and liberties that have to stay and sustain, and the crude patriarchal, autocratic governance. But my question was, you mentioned very short the socialism, and you said that we cannot rely on it because it's also patriarchal and it's also resource-oriented. And in this connection, my question is, of course, we have to keep up the liberties, and this is really important, but our experience shows that the policies of liberties as such, they failed to solve political-economic issues, the issues of poverty. So decolonial theory or gender theory, it definitely works with representation and liberation and emancipation. But to what extent it allows to solve the socioeconomic problems is not clear. Therefore, maybe instead of juxtaposing paternalism and autocracy and neoliberal autocracy and liberalism, maybe we should put the agent of social democracy, which is actually the descendant of Menshevism. Maybe at least having Menshevism would be that katechon which stands against capitalism and neoliberal capitalism. It's just my assumption.
Thank you. No, very much. I think I resonate with what you said. And I might have gone over this too quickly, but I was saying, even though you can point, socialism isn't necessarily not extractive, and it isn't necessarily not patriarchal. And we can see historical examples of that. But I was saying, there's nothing ontologically at the base of socialist theory that necessitates patriarchy, that necessitates extraction. Whereas I think in liberalism there is, because this notion of the independent self, that therefore is a possessive self, meaning I own myself, even in the liberal feminist idea of my body, my choice. It isn't my body in the sense, if you start with an acknowledgement of dependency and vulnerability, those claims, it's not that you can't have a kind of autonomy, but those claims are difficult to make. So I agree with you. I think socialism has ample resources for more gender, decolonial, ecological justice. And that's probably, again, back to this question of nationalism, that's one of the problems that happens when there's a claim of independence and national recognition. Those claims of political independence are usually not enough to become independent of a global capitalist system. And this becomes a problem. How to step outside of that is often the problem that I think new independent decolonial movements are faced with, because not only does global capitalism want to include everyone, it actively crushes those who would like to operate differently.
Okay, Alexander.
Cara, I think we already had the beginning of this argument, so I'm continuing on it, and it is about saving the liberal and emancipatory aspects of petro-modernity, of course, because I think from the perspective of now, of course, this double threat of Putinism and Trumpism part 2, it seems to be very convincing and necessary to draw this image of petro-masculinity as a major threat, but we already had this in Stavanger. In our understanding, the amount of comfort and well-being, at least in some of the petro-modern nations, societies in which it somehow succeeded, this model as a social and economic model, set free a lot of possibilities and energies, I think. And even if the suburban wife was confined at the beginning to a life as a subaltern suburban wife, still she had the opportunity to use the car and go somewhere else. And I think there is something to that, that a lot of or the American graffiti thing. I think that this is already actually a staging of gender roles, right from the beginning. You have it's like voguing, like in Judith Butler's way how she describes the voguing scene in New York, the ballroom scene. So all these gender roles from the very beginning, actually, of this post-war society are in a way enacted. And that opened up a lot of opportunities. And I'm wondering, so I think that all the LGBTQ diversification, the proliferation of different modes of empowerment and of representation owe actually a lot to the system as well. And I wonder how you would describe the relationship between this specter of petro-masculinity and all of this, because to my understanding, it's a reactionary reaction because of an understanding that this system, this very system that they're trying to get on top again, actually enabled all those liberations that they hate. So, you know, it's like a dialectic movement, but what to do with all the others? But one last example, which I also love, and this is, of course, one of the first punk groups, the New York Dolls, consisting of transvestites, and one of the musicians called herself polystyrene. I mean, this kind of, you know, affirmation of plastics, of petrocultures, of course, is in the heart of subcultural developments in not only in the West but also in the East, beginning at least in the 1960s until the 2000s.
Yeah, so I think there's that evocative line from Dipesh Chakrabarti, which is that modern freedoms are built on the combustion of fossil fuels, or something to this effect. What I would say is thinking, again, from that an ecofeminist perspective, thinking about what is extracted and exploited to make those freedoms possible. The real freedoms felt and experienced in some places is part of the affective charge and required terrible violence and cruelty, usually elsewhere. So, and this is why I always come back to Césaire, this question of what happens to a people when this effort to deal with that violence gets overwhelming. It's sort of like the throwing things away and putting things elsewhere comes back and washes back over the flood walls. And this, to me, is how you explain the relationship with petro-masculinity. Yes, you could say, oh, it's people mad that now women want that too. But I don't think that's it. I think it's a reaction to saying we feel now and see and are being told by a lot of people and by the earth itself, you could say, that this whole system is requiring a lot of violence. And instead of saying, oh, oops, I'm sorry on behalf of America for this colonial violence or reflection of responsibility, a responsibilization, the answer is to see it clearly and say, I embrace it. And I'm nostalgic for a time when that was a morally okay thing to do. And so, yeah, I think this is when I sort of flippantly said, I don't know about the left having a really good affective strategy. It's because most of our strategy is is sort of mournful and difficult, taking responsibility, appreciating historical violence. It's a project of reflection and growth and critique, a project that Nietzsche said usually for many people creates ressentiment and a kind of refusal and denial of that work. So I think that's the problem, is it's really appealing because for a lot of people, myself included, there are joys and pleasures and so-called freedoms that come from burning fossil fuels. And it's hard to even see what desires and freedoms are possible outside of that system because of the infrastructure that has cemented it into the way my life operates rhythmically. And the ask is to, I think in some ways this is why the right has a clear-eyed view, to me, of the climate crisis. They have a bad response, but they have a clear-eyed view because they see it as an existential challenge. They say, oh, you climate left just want to change the American way of life, and they're right.
Okay, Susanna and then Sina.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cara. That was really very, very inspiring. Thanks you so much. I found this basic argument about how the concepts of gender and energy kind of inform each other extremely convincing. I guess I would have two questions that come more from the perspective of cultural history, maybe. And the first would be that that it seems to me that this idea of energy and masculinity are that field might be much more differentiated in just depending on what type of energy we're talking about, whether it's fossil fuels, whether it's nuclear energy, whether it's hydropower, and that very specific and very different or diverse types of masculinity are tied up with each of these different types of energy, and whether you would agree with this. I found this very compelling in one of the slides that you showed, where you have this Soviet nuclear propaganda poster, where you very much have the image of a scientist, and not of kind of this bare-chested, I don't know, oil beauty. And the other question goes more to the maybe mythological underpinnings of this idea. Earlier today we were talking about Alexander Atkins' idea or concept of Gaia modernity. And it very much seems to me that this might be also an argument to just get rid of Promethean, is this how you pronounce it? Promethean modernity, because I mean, Prometheus was, how do you pronounce Prometheus? Prometheus, yeah, was the one who kind of set us on fire in the first place. And is that kind of an argument to we should get rid of Promethean modernity and kind of turn towards Gaia modernity as the female goddess that should inspire the way we think about energy and fuel?
I tend to be suspicious about figurations that that go into this kind of trans-historical idea that that there's something about humans that seek Promethean power, because this is the dominant understanding of energy transition that I think is a modern telling of history from the perspective of technomodernism. And if we want to talk about the human species, what we can see is a huge diversity of ways of organizing energy and also power. There's nothing human or transhistorical about the seeking of energy expansion or energy dynamism. And I'm very convinced by the idea that this really is a political formation of empire of the last circa 500 years. So in that sense, it's not even really fossil fuels, but I think fossil fuels accelerate and intensify it. And again, these three hidden abodes, the way that they're knit together is very specific to this historical period. The way the state you could say crudely serves capital, but I think it's bigger than that. It's the way all of these legitimation strategies work together. Because there's even interesting scholarship about capitalism pre-existing kind of modern imperial capitalism. Like markets existed, global trade existed, merchants and so on, people who wanted to maximize profit existed. So it really, to me, is a specific historical formation that then maybe what you're calling Promethean modernity. Yeah, I do think we have to, the idea of transition is transitioning from Promethean modernity. What fossil fuels added to the story, in my mind, starting in the 19th century, was a shifting idea about nature from a kind of enlightened background out of which so-called man takes things and resources to use them, and this is like the Western man version, into an entropic world, a world that is dying and going towards heat death. And then fossil fuels are this way to intensify work and production in the face of a dying nature. So it gives it, not only intensifies the project, but it gives it urgency, and it gives this dynamism and expansion a kind of endlessness. This goes to Oksana's work, an endlessness that goes on until heat death. That's the fossil fuel part, but there's this bigger 500-year story of knitting together the hidden abodes. So if we want to start to envision alternatives, to me it has to go back to are those alternatives assuming that extraction from those hidden abodes is remaining in place, or are we actually thinking clearly about dependency? And dependency is not a romantic world of skipping through the forest. Life is full of violence. Dependency is not necessarily happy, and neither is care. But that's part of that responsibility piece. And I guess what I'm worried about is how to make it not just not sexy to be on fire, but how to make sure there's a pleasure and affective charge to that, to the non-Prometheus.
Okay, but you just seen the second one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I was watching then. We'll pass the microphone. Yeah, thanks a lot for your talk. I was wondering about if you could elaborate on this relationship between, let's say, petro-masculine trad bros and tech bros, because like when we talk about petro-masculinity, and it's kind of phantasm of going back to the 50s, big cars, and all the imagery that you showed. You also mentioned a lot of like mimetic terms from basically the internet, so that exist in the manosphere and so elaborated. So it's not like as if this reactionary going back to the 50s happens basically in the digital sphere that doesn't really concern like industrial production proper. And if we talk about, for instance, about the intersection with the tech bro, or what we could call right-wing accelerationist masculinity, it's actually based not only not simply on extractivist relationship to the energy, but on the fantasies of abstraction from any energy sources, abstract digital science, and especially in the crypto culture, in the crypto bro culture, it's mostly about a disavowal of energy sources, not about like clinging to the imagery of energy, but at the same time they intersect. So how could you elaborate on that kind of weird historical, ideological conjuncture as regards the different energy sources?
Yeah, I'll pick up on the data piece because it's fascinating. The first person I mentioned, David Sachs, who's going to be the AI and crypto czar, and you're right, this feels very dematerialized, but it's not, of course. It's not dematerialized. And what's interesting is if you look at the development of sciences of energy, practices of energy. In the middle of the 20th century, you move into cybernetics, and energy science is really important to cybernetics, and their energy becomes information. Energy starts to be conceived in cybernetic theory as information. So the movement of what you might think of as agency or power is thought of in terms of information. And then, of course, there's just the brute fact that to transmit information is an energetic practice. So I very much see these as linked in terms of expansion. This idea of AI and big data and crypto too are all relying upon an energy expansionist project, both ontologically, because information in some sense is energy, but also just that they factually need a lot of energy to do those computations. But it is fascinating, right, the way that they are so dematerialized in popular discourse, that they are just these free-floating cloud things that will like drop down and solve climate change and gender problems and everything.
Yeah, exactly. But at the same time,
It
exists in this.
Yeah. Sorry, yeah, but we have 4 questions and 10 minutes. So I ask to keep this horizon in mind when you pose your question and also answer. Okay, Sina, Oksana, and Johanna. Yeah?
Oh, thank you very much, Cara, for the nice presentation. I have 2 questions, but I will leave one. I will quickly go into the second one, which is very unique to what I'm going to present tomorrow. People usually confuse this type of presentation because what you presented is similar to gender thing I will also present tomorrow. But the question people usually ask is, how do you do this and you are not actually activist? Just the follow-up with our discussion during the lunch. And it's a question I still want to put back because when some people listen to things like this, they will just say, oh, this is activist person presenting things relating to gender and so on. Mm-hmm. But how do we balance this? The science, which is core value of part of what we do in our research institute, with activism. Thank you.
What a great question. I come from I really have learned a lot from feminist science studies, so I just flat out don't think science is separate from politics, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because also what I think is politics is not what is usually called politics. So the hesitation on the part of scientists to involve themselves in politics is really, to me, going along with power and not being conscious of the way power has already entered their work. And so what's called for is reflection on that. And yeah, the second thing of having people say, oh, you're just an activist, or this isn't real science because I have an opinion, or it's radical. Those are all the things I'm talking about that I feel to be obstacles, not really just to me, but to a lot of people with alternative visions. Yeah, it's just to say, I've had people roll their eyes and say, oh, a feminist perspective on it, what is that about? I think the dismissal and the obstacle to being taken seriously is a problem, and that's probably my interest in liberalism, because my feeling is that a lot of the scientists who might feel that way, not all scientists do feel that way, but the scientists who do feel that way are very much coming from a liberal perspective where there are these separate spheres. There's politics, there's the economy, there's science, and never the twain shall meet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Johanna.
I think someone else wanted to ask a question, but I have the mic, so okay. Okay, thank you so much. I have a historian's question, because I find it fascinating to see the relation between the definition of masculinity and technological revolutions. And I wonder if actually, since, I don't know, the birth of agriculture, any technological revolution hasn't fostered a crisis of masculinity and an attempt to reaffirm masculinity from the part of the group that beneficiated the most from concentration of wealth at a moment when obviously other people would have to work for this technological revolution without reaping the benefit from it. So I don't know, it's really a question that came to me in your talk, and then the opposition to that would be how feminist thought, feminist philosophy, or could help imagine a new politics of liberation in this fight for ecological transition, that indeed is not always the way we talk about the ecological transition, because there's so much fear about the end of the world and that is involved in these discussions that we don't really see any politics of liberation. I'm stuck with this expression, but and I see there is a connection with the reaffirmation of masculinity in opposition to that. Thank you.
I think that's why some of my favorite feminists, like Rosa Luxemburg, end up with anarchy, with anarchism, because this growing suspicion that whatever is the state, that centralized power itself is a technology that has usually been practiced through hegemonic gender orders in all kinds of different ways, not in this particular way, whatever this imperial formation is. And therefore that the project of liberation is about power and how it's arranged, and the arrangement of the centralization of power has usually happened through capturing what we now are being told to call reproductive labor. So someone like Maria Mies, I'm not sure I buy this argument, but it's fascinating, goes back to the weapon and says that actually the agricultural gathering and gardening labor that in many places in early agricultural societies was done by women is the productive work, and the origin of this kind of hegemonic masculinity is that weapons happen to be a way to capture productive resources. Again, I get nervous or itchy around transhistorical arguments, but I do think there's something to the suspicion of specific technological revolutions that are about the centralization of power. And that's not every technological innovation. I think if we have a broader sense of how humans have lived across the entire species history, most technological innovations and arrangements of power do not look like a centralized state with a king and technological control. But that's the written history we have says that that is actually very common. Yeah, I'm interested in these bigger questions, but sometimes it feels a little too neat and tidy. But certainly there's something to the arrangement of state power and technological control that has something to do with patriarchal orders. Yes.
Okay, and the last question, Oksana.
If anybody else, maybe, because I have a feeling that I'm not the only one, so maybe we will just, everybody will
as well as I saw...
Maybe we can just have all the questions in a row.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, then I can start this round. Thank you for the talk. By the end of the day, I'm getting a little bit utopian. I drew a triangle, so to say, energetic triangle of petro-capitalism, which includes three sides. The three sides of this triangle are three types of energy, three types of everything. The political power, right? Then energy in its direct technological sense, so energy. And then you mentioned that the third one is libidinal. Which is also energy. So there is a correspondence and a mutual influence, and there is a knot of these three types of power, to which one would oppose what? Some other triangle, right? Where could be on the one side anarcho-communism or something, right? Then a question mark, the most problematic. And then the third is some other type of, not a libidinal energy, but maybe an alternative to that. And I remember, I was thinking about that, about the role of sexuality that you emphasize in the reproduction of the machine of, because this is also the war machine, this triangle of petro-masculinity, in its reproduction. And I thought, why the hell should things be sexy at all? So maybe sexuality is not what comprises a utopian horizon for a certain brighter future. So what if not? What if we are seeking not really for fire in some sexual sense, but some warmth in a sense of, I don't know, tenderness, love, and other great concepts that come from the feminist perspective or ecofeminist perspective, not as an alternative, not as just as an alternative, but as can come as a powerful weapon against the machine of sexuality that has some limits. So there are some limits to the machine of sexuality in the sense of Trump. For instance, like the figures, these petro-macho, they are not sexy, right? Absolutely not. So what the imagery they rely upon might be sexy, right? All those men, but those men are like proletarian, working class men, the big one. But those who are really in power are rather, so they need all this petro money in order to compensate for the lack of sexuality proper. So, and the absence of love. I mean, I remember there was a very nice article by Katie Chukrov, who is present here, on the re-evaluating sexuality and the difference of libidinal economies in a communist perspective and in a capitalist perspective. I think maybe this line can be elaborated upon a little bit if you think it's interesting to make these tiny differences between love, sexuality, tenderness as another kind of energy that can be distributed differently, not on the basis of this, I don't know, in a more, yeah.
I'll just say briefly, I agree, and I think I ended with sexy just because it's on this artwork, but I prefer to think about desire or pleasure, which maybe responds more. And I think what you just outlined about love and tenderness and warmth are precisely what I'm saying. That's the feminist message. And how often do we see that in energy transition plans? I mean, we do in the places the little bubbles we circulate in, but that message doesn't come in the big liberal feminism plans. Those are about like making women be on fire.
Okay, I think this is a great conclusion for the lecture and for the first day of our conference. So thank you so much, Cara. And yeah.
Thank you for hanging with me at the end of a